Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pro Opinion, where professionals share their opinion. I'm Diane,
I'm Professor Mel.
and we're talking raw knowledge and real expertise here. Today, our topic is pretty interesting, something that I've been wondering about too. And I know that some of our audience members might be wondering about as well. We're going to be talking about the criminal mind. so so I think we'll just begin with, why should we talk about this, Professor Mel?
Well, first, our behaviors are governed by our cognitive and emotional capability. And these emotional and cognitive capabilities are really driven by our brain. Unfortunately, the research along this line is rather slim or lacking. And for two reasons. Criminologists are very much interested in this phenomenon of the relationship between the brain and crime do not necessarily have the expertise to engage in the analysis of the brain function. On the other hand, those that have the expertise, such as the medical professionals or neurosurgeons on this matter, don't have the interest to find that connection. Rather, they're more interested in the real hard stuff, such as how our diseases, how our cognitive as well as impairment of the body is associated with the brain. Therefore, there is such a lack of research along this area. So the conclusion is that those that have the interest don't have the expertise to do it, and those that have the expertise don't really have any interest in finding that connection between crime. But there are some interest and expertise that try to look into this connection between the brain and crime.
It does sound like that's a real disconnect in the area, and of course, too, one of the things that makes this topic so interesting as well is, there are also lots of unknowns about the brain, or like also that entire area of like human behavior as well. Of course, we're focusing on the criminal mind here, but I'm sure there have been some research, and can you share some of those things with us?
Well, some of the research are not directly related to the brain, but there are some that are. But the first one that some scientists or even social scientists looked at mostly are, for instance, IQ, or the intelligence quotient, and EQ, or the emotional quotient. So along this line, researchers from both the medical as well as the criminological field have found consistently that IQ is related to criminality, and that those that have higher IQs tend to have less criminal behaviors, as opposed to those that have lower IQs who engages more in criminal and deviant behaviors. It is also being found that emotional quotient, or the emotional stability of a person, have a lot, and maturity for that matter, as indicated by EQ, is also well correlated with the criminality of individuals, and that those who score high on emotional quotient or EQ tend to commit less crime, and those that score low on that aspect also tend to commit more crime. But here's the interesting caveat to that. The relationship between IQ and EQ is positive, which means that those that have a higher IQ also tends to have also a higher emotional quotient or EQ. But the reverse is not true, which means that you might have a high emotional EQ, or EQ for that matter, but the IQ is not being influenced by that relationship. So I think there's still a lot more research that needs to be done to see the connection between these two. But there are some criminological research that tends to look at these sort of emotional indicators, such as being able to be patient or to have more emotional maturity and some sort of sympathy with others, as having an effect on criminal behavior. And so that those who have empathy, those that have sympathy, are less criminal than those who tend to show less of those positive emotional and maturity in their thinking.
I'm gonna ask you a quick question here, because you were talking about IQ and EQ. Um, it makes me think of movies like Silence of the Lambs, for example, where you seem to have really intelligent people. And I don't know if did you see the Inventing Anna, a Netflix series also, but it's this socialite who scammed the entire financial industry. It seems like made people think she's rich, and she scammed people of their money and banks and stuff like that. It just makes me think of those things when you were talking about IQ and EQ.
Uh, I have seen Silence of the Lambs a lot. And I've also read the novel by Thomas Harris about the Silence of the Lambs, but I haven't seen the movie about Inventing Anna. What I can say is that in the Silence of the Lamb, there is that interplay between the IQ of the lead character there, who was Hannibal Lecter, and the EQ of Hannibal Lecter. Because first, he seems to have a very high IQ, as indicated by his high level of education, being a psychiatrist, as well as a love for the finer things in life, if you might want to call that, good wine, good music, classical music. He actually exhibits characteristics of somebody who might have a high IQ. But if you take a look at his emotional stability, he seems to lack some of those that will indicate that he has some sympathy with other people, that he could empathize with how they feel. And there is actually a term for that, which is a psychotic tendencies or sociopathic tendencies that he might have. And therefore he becomes more, instead of being compassionate, he becomes manipulative. So he can actually play around those emotions and say, for instance, instead of showing true sympathy, he was actually just manipulating your emotions in order to get what he wants. And therefore, he is actually subverting his highly cognitive capacity into something that to realize his more emotional satisfaction, which is to manipulate individuals. So, and there's a lot more nuance to how we can analyze Hannibal Lecter on the basis of other criminological theories. For instance, there is this Darwinian principle of somebody who is always wanting to show superiority over others. And therefore he exudes that superiority over others, that there should be nothing or no one better than he is. And that is indicated again by his desire to have the good and finest things in life, as well as the highest level of sophistication and intelligence that he could show. including the manipulation of his own emotions and the emotions of other people.
So, one thing that you were talking about made me think of this. I mean, what about people's egos, for example? I mean, how do people's egos kind of play into, I don't know, their criminal tendencies? I don't know, something like those kinds of behaviors.
Well, if we begin to be technical about it, ego is actually what Sigmund Freud calls as your socialized self, right? Or restrained self. In his psychoanalytic analysis of human beings, he said that individuals go through several stages in their lives. And there are three, some sort of factors that determine somebody's behavior if they don't develop or overdevelop some of these things. And he said there are these three factors contradict each other sometimes. So we have the unsophisticated, undeveloped stage, which is the id, right? Which indicates that if you have that overpowering personality of satisfying your id, it means that you are acting like a child, you're very impulsive, you are also very oral, you want something here and now, you're not actually delaying gratification. And those are all indicative of somebody who has not fully developed their rational as well as restraint in their life. So they act like a child. So they throw tantrums and they use violence in order to get what they want. And therefore that explains the reason why Freud was saying that if you have an underdeveloped personality and make your ego become the dominant personality, then you will become an antisocial person. And at the same time, the extreme of that is ego, where you are always aiming for the moral and the ethical and so on. But at the same time, you also sometimes become delusional to the point of being unrealistic in your expectations, and you get easily frustrated. So some of those folks that have this overpowering super ego might resort into violence, not against themselves, right? As suicide or violence towards society because they want to attain a certain level of ethical and moral dimension, and that could only be achieved through violence. But what keeps the id and the super ego in check is what we call the ego. And the ego is like the center, the balancing personality, so that one will be tempered, or both of the ego, the id and the super ego will be controlled. And so those that have greater criminal tendencies have dominance in the id or sometimes the super ego, but those that are non-criminal have been found to have a greater dominance in their ego.
Oh, okay, so that's good. If you work with someone with so much ego, it's fine.
That's actually a misuse of the word term from a psychoanalytic perspective, because when you say he's got too much ego, he's so full of himself, right?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
himself. And but that's not the real meaning of that from the psychoanalytic perspective. That's actually what we call as the a street name, or what we call the street cred use of that term.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you think that some of these qualities are inherited?
Again, that's a very good question, and this has also been looked at by criminologists in terms of their what we call as gene theory line of research. And unfortunately, the line of research that emerged in criminology has started to be very crude for that particular line of research. For one, they normally use what they call as the twin studies, so that they can take a look at how twins from two different or two different kinds of twins in two different environments or from two different parents will behave. For instance, in these twin studies, we have a dizygote, which is the fertilization of two eggs by two sperms at the same time, producing two fetuses. They try to look at what is the difference between the dizygote and a monozygote, which is the opposite, where you only have one sperm and one egg being fertilized that split into two nucleus later on and fetuses and therefore are split, right? The theory is that monozygotes will tend to have greater convergence in their behavior and that the dizygotes will have less convergence in their behavior coming from two different eggs or sperm, right? But they found that though it doesn't matter really with the twins, the monozygotes tend to become more converge in their behaviors rather than the dizygotes. They also looked at separating them or twins who are separated at birth between monozygotes and dizygotes. And again, the consistent pattern is that dizygotes tend to diverge more in their behaviors, and monozygotes tend to converge more regardless of the environment, whether or not their environment is criminogenic. When it comes to parents, they were also experimenting on whether twins that grew up with two different parental households, where with your natural parents, one growing up in a foster parent or a step parent, and again they found that dizygotes and have tendencies to converge, or monozygote for that matter, have tendencies to converge in their criminal behavior or their behaviors in general, rather than dizygotes. The other theory that was looked at is the passing off of these genes. And that was the original question I think you have about, can these genes be passed on from one generation to the other? And in criminology, the most often cited study was one done by Henry Goddard in tracing the Calicat genealogy. And so there was this couple, Martin and the wife, Calicat is their last name, who are normal people, meaning they have no abnormalities in their brain.
Okay.
And however, Martin also had another union with a girl that has a condition of being feeble-minded. Right? So he tried to look, the scientist here, Goddard, tried to look at the offsprings that were produced by these two unions, one with normal unions, as what we might want to call it, and the other is the abnormal union of the genes, right? One having been feeble-minded, the other one not. And looking at their descendants or offsprings, he found that there are more normal people that are in the lineage of the normal union than those that are in the abnormal union. That feeble-mindedness was passed on to several generations of offsprings that were produced by that union between a normal person and somebody who has feeble-mindedness. And so that sort of demonstrated how genes can be transmitted from one person to the next, or from one generation to the next. But that was actually a very crude way of studying genetic factors. But more recently, in the Harvard School of Medicine, Greg and Dulac started looking at the transmissibility of these genes by parents. And they call it the genetic imprinting method, where they determined whether some of those characteristics of the genes is transferred over to the children. And what
Uh-huh.
they found is a very interesting finding, which shows that indeed there is a genetic imprinting of your parents to their children.
Hmm.
That, however, and here's the most interesting thing, there seems to be a conflict between these two genetic contributors, from a mother to a father. And they refined it a little bit. They refined the findings a little bit about the transmissibility of
Mhm.
genes from one offspring to the other by looking at uh, the actual imprint of those genetic factors in the brain. Uh, and what they found is that at the early period or early childhood development of a child, the mother has the more dominant gene that
Mm.
is absorbed by the kid. However, this is flipped in adulthood, where the father begins to have more dominant uh, influence on the behavior and the genetic makeup of the brain of the child in adulthood. And so, um,
That's
but that doesn't really explain
yeah.
criminality a lot, because as we have, but it found a little bit of support for the Calicut study, where these genes are passed on from one generation to the other. But as far as being a definitive determination as to the criminal gene, there is none of that yet. Uh, what is, however, been found as more consistent was that if you have certain damages in your brain, so talking about brains now, leaving that genetic thing, uh, genetic theory, is that, and because it can be transmitted, it's very important to look at some of these damages that you might have, whether or not it can be transmitted over. But
Mhm.
it's been found consistently that when you have a damage in your prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is this part of your brain right here, it also tends to be correlated with higher criminal tendency.
Oh, why?
Well, the prefrontal cortex right here is what we call as the cognitive part of the brain. It
Mm-hmm.
processes and reasons out the sort of information that the brain is receiving. When it is damaged, the one that takes over your behavior and emotional uh, tendencies is what we call as the amygdala, which you have in this inner part of your brain, right? It's also what is called as the instinctive part of
Mm-hmm.
your brain. So you begin to, this is the one that dictates your fear, your bravery, and so on. And it's very instinctive in nature. And so they are connected to each other, so that the prefrontal cortex is supposed to process those information to give out reason, so that it can relay that information to the amygdala, and so it can temper what the amygdala is instinctively doing with that information. But when there is a damage to that prefrontal cortex, it cannot transmit that information over, and therefore the amygdala's instinctive characteristics become more prominent and more
Mm.
dominant in the behavior of a person. So somebody will lack self-control, right? And we know from criminology that people with lower self-control will have greater criminal tendencies than people that with high self-control. That was actually developed by Gottfriedson and Hershey in their study of self-control. And therefore, this shows you, or this indicates that that damage in the brain, and that disconnect between the processing of this information in your brain can have some effect on your criminality. And so if you merge that together, right? King's College look at this when they looked at when there is like a white mass in your prefrontal brain matter, and it's like disrupting the communication of those information to your amygdala, that you begin to have greater lack of irrational, or you begin to have irrationality in your behavior, becoming more impulsive in your decision making, rather than more controlled and intuitive in the way you behave. And that was found in the King's College in London. But if you merge that together with the information in the Harvard School of Medicine, then we can actually start to see how the brain can effectively influence somebody's criminal behavior, as well as their emotional stability and maturity.
I wanted to see if our audience members or our viewers have any comments about this topic. Um, it's all pretty good discussion. Appreciate everybody who's joined us. Thank you for sharing, Professor Mel. And we will see you next time here at ProPinion. And next time we're gonna talk about another topic, and we'll definitely keep it raw knowledge and real expertise.
Don't
Bye.
forget to click and subscribe.
Oh, yes.